possibilities, because I make a move in chess, there are about 30 things you can do typically, and then the other person can make about 30 replies. And so in 2 layers, that's 30 times 30, it's about 1,000. And 4 layers, it's 1,000,000. And 6 layers, you're up to 1,000,000,000 possibilities. And a computer today could do 1,000,000,000 chess moves in a minute or two, but in those days it would take weeks or more. So you're sort of getting a tree. Each limb has 30 branches, and each branch has 30 twigs, and each twig has that sort of thing. And so you have to prune the tree. So a lot of AI research in the 1950s was finding wonderful new ideas about how to reduce these search trees so that you could solve harder problems in the same time. And I'd say there was 10 years of progressive and interesting discoveries about that.
Now, some of these projects had really quite spectacular success, and they presented this paradox that these were among many of the things which most human beings considered very difficult to do. You mentioned previously Slagle's program. Was that a good example?
A wonderful example was, and I think he was my second graduate student. Manuel Bloom was the first. Jim Slagle decided to write a program which would try to solve the kinds of problems that MIT students do in the first year calculus mathematics. And the problem was doing what we call symbolic integrals. And he wrote a program which consisted of more or less 100 kinds of rules or suggestions. Let's say if you see 1 minus x squared in a math problem, the mathematicians know it's very tempting to say x equals sine y, or some trigonometric thing. The reason has to do with the fact that in a circle, the equation is x squared plus y squared equals 1. It's very familiar to mathematicians, very alien to everyone else. But anyway, Slagle wrote down about 20 rules of thumb, suggestions for how to solve a calculus problem, another 20 or 30 rules for how to do high school algebra, because you can't do calculus without algebra, and then a profound set of another dozen or so suggestions about how to tell when a problem's getting too hard and you should try another one. Well, you see, in calculus, to solve one of these things, there are many things you can try. It's like chess. You could try moving this pawn or that knight, and in calculus, you could try using a logarithm here, or a trigonometric, or a sine or a cosine, or just multiplying or dividing. And there are all sorts of alternatives when you're doing the algebra. So he wrote down these, about 100 rules altogether. The machine would try various ones, and then it would use the special set of rules. I called them rules of fear. If the thing got too complicated, it would say, that's no good, it's too complicated. But if it seemed to be getting simpler, it would follow it further. Well, the amazing thing, and this was 1960, just a couple of years after we started, the thing got an A on the MIT exam, and it was frightening. It was doing as well as the average student, or maybe slightly better. It couldn't do some problems, could do others, and the kinds of problems it solved were pretty much like the kind the students did.
So then a few years later you had one which dealt with high school algebra, which was a more difficult problem.
Well, of course, this calculus problem is a very purely formal problem. It's all in equations and mathematical expressions. And although those are frightening to some people, they're simpler than words. Danny Bobrow in 1964 started a program to do the same sort of algebra, except that it would be word problems. Problems like John is twice as old as Mary was when she was the same age as, those are things that high school students find very difficult, actually. Although the algebra is terribly easy. But the problem is that the words have too many meanings, and if you look at mathematical symbols in algebra, maybe it's like a language with only 20 words, plus, minus, x squared. Such a small vocabulary in pure mathematics, but in the vocabulary of ordinary language, 10,000 for a normal person, 100,000 for a very articulate person. And so the kinds of things that every little child learns to do, like talk with 10,000 words, is much, much harder, we found, to our surprise, than solving the kinds of things that a PhD mathematician would do in a world of expertise. And this went on for 20 years, from the middle 1950s to the middle 1970s. We found it was became easier and easier to do, to get machines to do things that people admired as expertise, but it was very hard to creep downwards from the college level to the adolescent to the child to the infant and see if we could get a machine to learn the kinds of things that everybody considers perfectly natural and simple and obvious.
You, as you said in one of your papers that actually AI showed a tendency to regress towards infancy, didn't you? It started out.
Yes, it was a very strange field because it had this backwards regression. We started out in the 1950s. Newell, Simon, and Shaw in Pittsburgh wrote a program that did very amusing things with mathematical logic, and it proved theorems in mathematical logic. They were pretty hard. They found a proof that was better than the best one that Russell and Whitehead found, and Bertrand Russell was sort of impressed. And the machines were starting to play chess and do calculus and that sort of thing. Everybody's very impressed because machines were doing hard things. But what we began to see is that the things that people think are hard are actually rather easy, and the things that people think are easy are very hard. We could do the calculus with just a few hundred pieces of program, but to learn language, to recognize faces, to walk, and to put your clothes on and do the kinds of things we expect every child to do, we still can't do with the robots of and AIs of 1990.
Let's look at some of those things that turned out to be hard and try to understand why they're hard. Why should understanding language, understanding children's stories, why should that be a difficult task?
There are several ways to explain this. A humorous way would be that it took animals, took about 3 billion years for the first, to go from the first cells to the vertebrates, the fish and the amphibia and the reptiles, and then 400 million years to go from the first animals to the chimpanzee. And then it's just 400 million years, you see, and then it's just 4 or 5 million years to go from the chimpanzee to man. So you might expect in that sense that the kinds of things that the chimpanzee or the child can do are very hard, and the difference between the chimp and the man, which is playing chess and doing calculus and things like that, difference between a kid and an adult, would be relatively simple in a sense. First, you had to get the basic brain that's able to learn complicated things. The complicated things themselves are nothing. So that's one reason. I think the other reason is that why was it easy to build these expert systems? And this is my own theory, that if you look at the expert systems out there today that do such good things like chess, each one is based on a certain way of representing the world. We call this representation of knowledge or model of the world or something. And these wonderful high-powered programs each use one way of representing the world and one way of representing knowledge. But in language, each thing we do uses, I suspect, 3 or 4 major different kinds of representations and maybe 20 or 30 minor ones. And so everything that an ordinary person does in ordinary life consists of maybe 20 different ways of proceeding and all their relations between them. That's much more complicated than the kind of precise, narrow thing that an expert does. For example, when I see a dog, I recognize it as a physical object, and part of my brain says, oh, that interesting thing weighs about 4 pounds, and it has this color and so forth. Another part says, it seems to want something. So I have an emotional, not emotional, but I have a social reaction to it in terms of social communication and maybe their defense mechanism. I have to treat this as a threatening situation. Is it going to bite? When you meet a person, you're discussing a particular topic, you're wondering how you're getting along with them, you're trying to cope with cultural differences. If I meet somebody, they say, where do you live? If they're a foreigner, I say, I live in Boston, or I live in the east coast of the United States. If there's somebody from this area, I say Brookline. But I know that strangers don't know where Brookline is. They might have heard of Cambridge. And so every time a word comes in, the way I react to it depends on many different other kinds of knowledge. And I don't think these problems are unsolvable at all. In fact, in the Society of Mind, I propose some theories of it. But I feel that the research community working on artificial intelligence got so addicted to its success with expert systems that almost everybody in the community is saying, if we just get exactly the right representation, we can solve all problems. And I think the reason why it's hard to get a machine to behave like a child is that it's not finding the right representation that's important at all. It's finding 6 or 10 representations and discovering how to manage the relations between them. I don't think that's a very hard problem, but for some reason, no one works on it. It's outside the scope of what people consider their job.
Now we'll change the right? Speed? Yeah. Your thoughts on the Society of Minds, which I'll come to, that came out of your work on Blocks World, didn't it? I wonder. I mean, or many of the ideas were developed during that. I wonder if you could tell me how the Blocks project started. And
Can't remember.
there's a story that's told. I don't know whether it's apocryphal, which says that this was conceived of as a holiday project. Is that true or not?
There's a garbled story about Jerry Sussman.
Yeah, is that true or not?
No, what was true is that we had a vision project trying to get the machine to see these blocks and other things, and it wasn't working very well, and there was a very smart freshman named Gerald Sussman. So I decided that the reason the vision project wasn't working very well was that everybody must be on the wrong track, and so I put him in charge of it for one summer. And because he had had many ideas of his own, and I thought it might be a good chance to see if a beginner would do better. And he didn't do worse than the others. The legend changed into, I've seen it written that Minsky put a graduate student in charge of the project, but that just shows how conservative people are. It was actually a freshman, and he's now a professor. He's a rather good freshman.
Why was stacking blocks a very difficult problem?
Well, we decided we wanted to make a machine that interacted with the real world, and a nice way to do that would be to give it eyes and hands. And so I decided we should try to get the computer to be able to see things, and when it sees something, it should be able to do something with it, pick it up. And that turned out to be very complicated indeed, because when you try to recognize an object, it's easy enough to get a picture into a computer. We made circuits that used things like television cameras, which were just beginning to be usable. And the trouble is that a block or a box is different. You move it this way, it's a different shape. And so you almost never see the same thing twice. Sometimes there's shadows on it, sometimes it's darker or lighter. Different boxes have different surfaces. Sometimes there are things written on it. So that even though to you or me or a child the idea of seeing a block seems simple, it's actually very, very complicated. It's out of focus. Sometimes if the light on two sides is just the same intensity, you cannot see the edge. So there are plenty of problems. And it turned out that somebody would write a computer program to locate a block, and it would work on 3 blocks out of 10 or 5 blocks out of 10. It just wouldn't find the others. Then another person would write another program to find blocks with a different idea, and it would work on different blocks. It wasn't that you could say each program got a score of 40% or 80% or something. Each different program would be better or worse at different jobs. And what I began to sense was that we should stop looking for a very good vision program, and this concept came to Papert and me around the same time. We were working together. The idea was, all right, let's see if we could get 10 pretty good vision programs and get them and manage them and see which of them seem to be working in different situations. So the idea of the Society of Mind was that in the brain or in the mind or in a computer, you shouldn't look for perfection, and you shouldn't go around trying to debug programs and find the best possible way to do something. You should find a lot of different ways and have different resources, and then you should make managers that can decide under which circumstances to use which ones. Now, I still think this is the way to make big programs work better, but no one does it. And so this idea, which is now from about the late 1960s, and now it's the early 1990s, in spite of how simple and clearly correct this idea is, it hasn't caught on, and I'm very disappointed in my colleagues and people in the field of AI in general. For some reason, they've gotten fixed on the idea, let's get it right. And that's wrong. There is no right in the world.
I mean, there was some, just before we go on, there's one sense that you said before that it was impossible to capture the knowledge of an expert. How was it, taking something like a child stacking blocks or listening to stories, what was different from the kind of things that they knew, children knew, as compared to experts? What was?
Well, what happens in understanding a simple story, my friend Roger Schank at Yale, now at Northwestern, had many of his students work on the problem of getting a machine to understand a simple children's story. We did that here and a few other places. And that's different from doing calculus or playing chess, because in chess there are a few rules. It's pretty clear what to do. It's very hard to know how to play as well as a human, and nobody's figured it out yet, although the programs now play better than most humans, maybe very much better, but they don't do it the same way, and they're still using a lot of search. But when you understand a story, you come across a word like boat. And what does boat mean? Well, that's a bad word, but when you look at it, you know so much. In calculus, if you see a sine function, you only need to have a few rules, at least to do calculus. But for a boat, you have to know different kinds of boats for different kinds of water. They're kind of
try another word, because this is
yeah, right.
What about with a
abandon the damn thing?
Yes.
Really a terrible word.
Or I wonder whether another way of approaching this would be through the story, the Charniak story, or something.
I think, well, a very simple one in linguistics is the word take. John took a trip to Mexico. Very strange word. Sometimes take means to obtain a physical object, to take it away from someone else. It's a social thing. Taking a trip, I don't know what that means. Take a look. You see, there are, if you look in the dictionary, you'll find 40 or 50 different entries. And so here's a set of meanings, a set of processes to be applied to the rest of the words. And you have hundreds of them in your head, because the ones in the dictionary are just the families of these. You have to use the other clues to decide which of these hundreds of different mental procedures to apply to the rest of the words, and each of the words has the same thing. Well, what I'm saying is that to understand even a simple sentence, you have to know thousands of different things. And my example before is to get an A in that part of freshman calculus, you only have to know 100 things. Now, I'm not saying that it passed the whole calculus course. I don't want to oversell this thing, but it did a certain large part of it, the formal integration, and that's part that people considered expert. Well, to understand a simple child story, you have to know so many hundreds and thousands of things, and they're different kinds of things. In a little child story, some word will talk about the geometric shape or the nature of space. Another one will talk about time. Another thing will engage social relations and a normal person's fear of the unknown, or greed, or acquisitiveness, or territorial defense. And just to begin to talk to a 4-year-old, you have to know all those things. So what I'm saying is, for a beginner to play chess, you have to know 100 rules. And if you do a little exhaustive search, you can avoid the simplest disasters. To talk to a little child, maybe you have to know 100,000 things. So what I'm saying is, these simple things like understanding a little story seems to me maybe 1,000 times more complicated than at least beginning to approach human competence in narrow expert domains.
Now, most people, is it true to say, in artificial intelligence move to a consensus around a knowledge-based paradigm, even if they didn't go along with you and Papert on Society of Minds?
Well, most people in every field end up in a few clusters of establishment. I don't know the statistics, but I'd say half of certainly in the applied area, a large proportion of people use rule-based expert systems. In the world of research, a large number of people use languages like Prolog, which make it easy to work with rule-based systems. In America, maybe most of the world, when it comes to representing knowledge, by far the majority of people, I think,
The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Do you have any opinions about consciousness? There's one problem in the artificial intelligence people is there's a lot of pretty smart people like Steve Pinker and others who think that the problem of consciousness is maybe the most important problem, and that no matter what we do in artificial intelligence, anybody read Pinker? I can't figure out what his basic view is, but there's a feeling that if you can't solve this all-important mystery, then maybe whatever we, excuse me, whatever we build will be lacking in some important property. There was another family of AI skeptics, like Penrose, who's the physicist, and a very good physicist indeed, who wrote more than, I think, 3 different books arguing that AI is impossible because trying to remember what he thought was missing from machines.
Quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics was one, and Gödel theorem, incompleteness, was another. And for example, if you try to prove Gödel's theorem in any particular logic, you'll find some sort of paradox appearing where it's, if you try to formalize the proof, you can't prove it in the logical system you're proving it about. I forget what that's called. So there are these strange logical and semi-philosophical problems that bother people. And Pinker's particular problem is he doesn't see how you could make a machine be conscious. And in particular, he doesn't see how a machine could have a sense called qualia, which is having a different experience from seeing something red and from seeing something green. If you make a machine with 2 photocells and put a green filter on one and a red filter in front of the other and show them objects of different colors, then they'll respond differently, and you can get the machine to print out green and red. And so forth. And he's worried that no matter what you do, the machine will only have some logical descriptions of these things, and it won't have a different experience from the 2 things. So I'm not going to get into that. I wonder if Word is going to do this all the time till I kill something. What if I put it off screen? That's a good way to deal with philosophical problems. Just put them in back where you can't see them. Oh, the picture disappeared. That's really annoying. Everything disappeared. Okay, think of a good question while I reboot this. Oops. Well, how about pressing? That did it. Whoops. That's the most mysterious problem. Does anybody have an explanation of why computers take the same amount of time to reboot, even though they're 1,000 times faster than they were?
They have to load 1,000 times more stuff nowadays.
Yes, but why can't it load the things that were running last time? For some reason, they feel they have to load everything.
Maybe there's a certain amount of time that they think humans are willing to wait. So therefore, they will load as much as they can during that time, right? Maybe there might be, if they could, they might, upload even more, but they can't because that's kind of the human patience, and so they always run it up to that point.
Does the XO take time to boot? Any?
It takes several seconds.
So it keeps memory in it? Or
It doesn't have a,
size. The fossil ones of, I think, about 4 million years ago are comparable to the present ones. So nobody knows why they stopped. But there are a lot of reasons why it's dangerous to make a larger brain. And especially if you're not a fish, because it would be slower and hard to get around.